My name is Hannah Parker, and I'm 28. I had spent the entire week leading up to Christmas imagining this night. The lights twinkling on the tree, the smell of roasted turkey filling the house, and the laughter of people I hoped would finally see me as family. My husband, Jason, had tried to reassure me, "Mom will come around. Just relax." But deep inside, I carried a quiet knot of anxiety, a premonition I couldn't shake. I arrived early, clutching a wrapped bottle of wine, my soft cashmere sweater hugging me like a warm promise. My chestnut brown hair was styled simply, and I wore light makeup, hoping to blend in without standing out. The house smelled like pine and cinnamon, every corner adorned with ornaments and fairy lights. It should have felt magical. But as soon as my mother-in-law, Eleanor, entered the room, her gaze landed on me like a judge passing sentence. She was in her usual posture, tall, rigid, a cardigan buttoned meticulously over a silk blouse, her pearl earrings gleaming under the chandelier. Her lips curved into a cold smile that didn't reach her sharp gray eyes. I tried to smile back, stepping toward her, but before I could utter a greeting, she said, "Hannah, I don't think you should stay tonight. Only blood family here." The words hit me like a punch. My fingers froze around the wine bottle, my throat tightened, and a hot wave of humiliation flushed my face. The room fell silent, the chatter of family members dying mid-laugh. I glanced at Jason, hoping he would intervene, but he looked torn, frustration flickering in his eyes, yet powerless to challenge his mother in that moment. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain calm, though my heart pounded in my ears. "Eleanor, I've been part of this family for 5 years. I'm Jason's wife, your daughter-in-law. I thought I was welcome tonight." Her expression didn't soften. Instead, she crossed her arms and shook her head slightly, the faintest hint of smugness on her lips. "Hannah, I said it's only blood family. You need to understand your place." I felt a twinge of anger rise, but more than that, a deep ache of betrayal. I had spent years trying to integrate into this family, helping with holidays, listening to stories of family traditions, remembering birthdays and anniversaries. I had baked pies, sewn decorations, and even accompanied her on last-minute errands without complaint. And yet, after all that effort, I was dismissed in a single sentence. The moment stretched, each second feeling heavier. My hands were trembling now, but I refused to let tears fall in front of her. I placed the wine bottle on the counter quietly, careful not to make a scene. I could feel Jason's hand brush mine in a silent apology, and I squeezed it back with a subtle nod that said, "It's okay, we'll handle this." I turned toward the rest of the room, attempting to mask my hurt with a polite smile. Cousins and aunts looked at me with wide eyes, sensing the tension, unsure whether to speak. My heart ached, not because I had been singled out, but because people I cared about remained silent. I realized then that this night wasn't about Christmas cheer. It was about power, control, and maintaining a hierarchy in which I had no place. I stepped back, taking another slow breath, grounding myself. I wasn't going to leave, at least not immediately, not without asserting my presence. "I came to celebrate with family," I said, keeping my tone even but firm. "I love Jason, and I love being part of this family, even if you refuse to see it." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned slightly, signaling to one of her daughters that I should be removed. The subtle gesture made me aware that this wasn't just about a harsh word. It was a performance, a display to the entire room that I didn't belong. I felt the anger and humiliation twist inside me, a mix that could have broken me if I let it. Instead, I chose to focus on something else: control. I couldn't control her words, her attitude, or the judgmental stares, but I could control my reaction. My mind raced, considering my options. Do I leave quietly and let her feel victorious, or do I stand my ground and remind her that her power over me is limited to her words alone? The smell of roasted turkey, the clinking of cutlery, and the faint hum of Christmas carols from the stereo felt surreal against the storm brewing inside me. I clenched my fists subtly under the table, reminding myself that humiliation was temporary. Years of trying to belong had been a lesson in patience, resilience, and self-respect. If Eleanor thought she could diminish me with a few words, she was gravely mistaken. Jason reached across the table, resting his hand lightly over mine. His eyes silently asked, "What do you want to do?" I gave a subtle shake of my head, signaling that I wasn't leaving.
Not tonight.
Not in this moment. I would let the evening unfold, gathering the subtle power of composure and strategy. I noticed her expression slightly falter, not out of regret, but because my refusal to cower disrupted the expected narrative. Family dynamics were often maintained through fear and compliance, and my defiance had introduced a variable she hadn't accounted for. From that moment, every conversation, every gesture, every clink of a glass became part of a silent battle. I smiled politely when her eyes tried to bore into mine. I responded to greetings with warmth, letting others see the real me, confident and composed. The humiliation she intended to impose didn't vanish entirely, but it diminished in power because I refused to feed it with panic or tears. By the time dessert was being served, I felt an internal shift. What Eleanor tried to weaponize against me, my status as an outsider, had inadvertently strengthened my resolve. I realized something profound. Inclusion and belonging were not given. They were taken through presence, dignity, and the subtle assertion of self-worth. I took a bite of pie, careful to chew slowly, savoring the taste and allowing myself a small, private satisfaction. The room watched me, still tense, but I noticed a few family members exchanging glances, perhaps reassessing their assumptions. In that quiet observation, I felt a spark of vindication, not loud or brazen, but undeniable. By the end of the night, I knew one thing clearly. Christmas hadn't been ruined by her words. It had been transformed into a crucible, a moment that revealed my own strength and the quiet power of composure under emotional assault. I left the table not humiliated, but measured, carrying with me a deep understanding that respect is earned, not dictated. Even as I stepped into the cold winter night after dinner, the lights from the house behind me glowing warmly, I felt a simmering sense of agency. The story wasn't over. Eleanor's words had stung, yes, but they had also illuminated the very truth she tried to deny, that I mattered, that I could assert my place, and that I could, in time, make her regret the casual cruelty she believed would define me. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the decorated streets, but it did nothing to ease the storm still roiling inside me. My hands gripped the car steering wheel tightly as I drove home, replaying every detail of the dinner over and over. Eleanor's words weren't just sharp. They were a declaration, a wedge driven straight into my sense of belonging. Only blood family, she had said. Those words echoed in my mind like a cruel chant, but rather than breaking me, they ignited something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Jason sat silently beside me, his jaw tight, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror as though searching for reassurance he couldn't find in me. "You okay?" he asked finally, voice soft but tense. I glanced at him, my chest heaving with frustration I hadn't been able to release at the dinner table. "I will be," I said, though my words felt empty even to me. "But she can't be allowed to do this again. Not to me. Not ever." He nodded, gripping my hand briefly. I could feel his solidarity, but it wasn't enough to erase the sting of rejection. What had been intended as a public humiliation had exposed deeper truths about my place in this family, truths I could no longer ignore. I realized I had been accommodating, bending, and yielding in a futile attempt to win approval that would never come voluntarily. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Eleanor's precise, cold inflection as she spoke. I remembered the gleam in her eyes, the way she had believed her authority was absolute. I wanted to rage, to cry, to scream, but mostly I wanted control. If she saw me crumble, she would win. And I refused to hand her that victory. The next morning I began small. I checked my bank account, calculated budgets, and listed everything I had contributed to holidays, gifts, and family events over the past years. The numbers weren't staggering, but they reflected my effort, my time, and my commitment. I realized, with a sting of irony, that I had given far more than my recognition or respect had warranted. But now, the power of those small contributions wasn't gone. They were evidence, quietly fortifying my position. I started reaching out to friends and distant relatives who had always been supportive. Not to complain, but to remind myself that family isn't always defined by blood. Connection, loyalty, and respect mattered just as much. In sending these texts, making phone calls, and even planning small post-Christmas gatherings, I felt a warmth and reassurance Eleanor had tried to deny me. Slowly, the humiliation began to lose its grip. 2 days later, I decided I needed a plan. Not revenge in the angry, impulsive sense, but a deliberate, satisfying recalibration of respect. I had to ensure that Eleanor understood she could not demean me publicly without consequence. I began compiling small, tangible steps, hosting dinner invitations at my home, coordinating holidays with other family members, and asserting subtle boundaries in conversation. Each move was calculated, precise, designed to establish my presence and command the respect that had been denied. Meanwhile, Jason remained conflicted. He loved his mother, yes, but he loved me more. I could see him struggling between loyalty and fairness, between old habits and new revelations. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I took his hand and said quietly, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about last night. This is about every time she's tried to diminish me, and every time I've swallowed it to keep peace. That ends now." He nodded, eyes wet with emotion. "I'm with you," he said. "Whatever you need." That weekend, I took the first step in reasserting myself. I invited a few of my closest friends and some extended family over for a casual brunch. Nothing flashy, just pancakes, fresh coffee, and laughter, but the symbolism was intentional. My home would be a place of inclusion and warmth, a place where no one's presence was dismissed by arbitrary notions of blood or hierarchy. As the morning unfolded, laughter filled the rooms. My friends complimented the decorations, the food, and my efforts. Extended family members, distant cousins and aunts, stayed to chat, drawn in by the ease and warmth of the gathering. I watched, quietly satisfied, as the subtle message crystallized. Respect and connection are not dictated by tradition alone, but by the atmosphere you cultivate and the dignity you uphold. It was around mid-afternoon when I received a text from Jason. "Mom is calling. She wants to speak to you." My heart skipped. I debated ignoring it, letting her stew in her discomfort, but something urged me to answer. I took a deep breath and said, "Hello, Eleanor." There was a faint pause on the other end. "Hannah," she said, voice unusually measured, almost hesitant. I've been thinking about last night." I allowed a brief moment of silence, letting her words linger. "Yes," I prompted softly, my tone calm and unflinching. I may have been too harsh," she said finally. The words sounded strange, almost alien, stripped of the usual dominance she wielded so easily. "Christmas is a time for family, and I might have spoken out of turn." I nodded, feeling the simmering satisfaction of control in my chest. Not triumph over her, not yet, but a recognition of my presence and the effect it had on her. "I understand, Eleanor. But it's important you know that words like that can hurt deeply, and they have consequences. I hope next time we can focus on inclusion rather than exclusion." She was silent for a moment. I sensed a subtle shift, a faint tremor in her previously unshakable confidence. The power she believed she held had been quietly challenged, not through anger or shouting, but through composure, presence, and strategic action. That afternoon, as I hung up the phone, I realized something profound. Respect could be earned not only by demanding it, but by living it, by refusing humiliation its power and showing grace under fire. The brunch, the deliberate assertion of my home as a space of warmth, and even the calm, measured conversation with Eleanor were all part of a narrative she couldn't control. And that was more satisfying than any immediate confrontation. The following days brought subtle changes. Eleanor began calling less with criticism, less with demands, and more with neutral, occasionally cautious conversation. Other family members started acknowledging me more openly, asking my opinion, seeking my input on plans and gatherings. Each interaction was a quiet reinforcement, a micro-victory that compounded into an undeniable recognition of my place. Jason noticed the difference too. One evening, as we prepared dinner together at home, he reached for my hand across the counter. "You've changed the way she treats us," he said, a mixture of awe and gratitude in his voice. "It's incredible to watch." I smiled softly, allowing a small sense of pride to settle. But more than pride, there was peace. The humiliation she had tried to impose had been transformed into a catalyst for empowerment. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was building a future where my dignity was non-negotiable, where inclusion and respect were my prerogatives, not hers. By the end of the week, I noticed that I no longer flinched at the mention of Eleanor or Christmas plans. I could attend family gatherings without anxiety, without rehearsing words or bracing for rejection. I had reclaimed the narrative, not through anger or retaliation, but through deliberate composure, strategic inclusion, and subtle assertion. And in the quiet moments, when I reflected on the events that had shaken me so deeply, I realized something even more important. The power she believed she wielded had always been conditional. It relied on my fear, my hesitation, my willingness to shrink. But once I stepped into myself, fully present, calmly assertive, and strategically engaged, her words lost their bite. The lesson wasn't merely about Eleanor or her cold-hearted dismissal. It was about understanding the power dynamics that permeate family structures, recognizing when to challenge them, and cultivating resilience. My journey through that single Christmas dinner became a broader journey of personal growth, a realization that self-respect, boundaries, and calm assertion can transform humiliation into quiet strength. By the time I sat down at our own modest dinner table that evening, candles flickering softly, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was both deep and enduring. The room smelled of roasted vegetables, cinnamon, and home-baked bread. Jason's hand brushed mine as we passed dishes, a silent acknowledgement of our shared victory. No dramatic confrontation, no loud retaliation, just the subtle, undeniable assertion that I belonged and that my dignity was intact. As I poured myself a glass of wine, I allowed a small, private smile. The memory of Eleanor's cold sentence lingered, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that I had turned the narrative in my favor. Christmas hadn't been ruined, it had been a crucible. And in that crucible, I had forged a deeper understanding of myself. Strong, composed, and unshakable. The days following the Christmas dinner passed in a strange mixture of relief and tension. Relief, because I had survived the humiliation without breaking down. Tension, because the underlying power dynamics in my marriage and extended family were still very much alive. I had learned that standing up calmly could shift perception, but I also realized that change would be gradual. Eleanor was not someone who admitted wrongdoing easily, and her pride ran deep. My challenge was not just to assert my presence, but to do it in a way that was undeniable, subtle, and strategic. I spent much of the morning reflecting on the events, trying to catalog every slight, every dismissive glance, and every small moment where I had been undervalued. Writing things down helped me process the emotions that had been swirling uncontrollably inside me. My journal became my confidant, a safe space where anger, hurt, and planning could coexist without judgment. The act of putting pen to paper allowed me to see patterns and recognize how often my compliance had been interpreted as weakness. By the middle of the week, I decided to start reclaiming my presence through small, deliberate actions. First, I focused on my home. It wasn't large or extravagant, but it was mine. I decorated it thoughtfully, mixing holiday warmth with personal touches that reflected my taste and personality. The act of creating a welcoming space was empowering. It reminded me that my environment could be a sanctuary, a place where respect was automatic because it was built upon boundaries I defined. I also began to engage more actively with extended family members who had previously been on the sidelines. I invited cousins, aunts, and even distant friends over for casual dinners and coffee dates. Each invitation was deliberate, not to flaunt my presence, but but to subtly demonstrate that warmth, hospitality, and inclusion were not privileges granted by Eleanor. They were qualities I could cultivate and share on my own terms. Observing the genuine smiles and relaxed conversations, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Here, at least, recognition and acceptance were given freely. Jason was an invaluable ally during this period. He had always loved me, but his understanding of family politics was evolving in real time. One evening, as we prepared a late dinner together, he mentioned his concerns about his mother. "I think she's realizing she can't control you the way she thought," he said cautiously. "But she's stubborn. Be careful. Don't let it escalate unnecessarily." I nodded, appreciating his caution but understanding that escalation was precisely what I wanted to avoid. My goal wasn't revenge through confrontation. It was quiet, undeniable reclamation of respect and presence. I wanted Eleanor to recognize that her authority had limits, and that dignity and composure could speak louder than anger or retaliation. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at our apartment. I invited a mix of friends, cousins, and a few extended family members. The atmosphere was intentionally light. Holiday music played softly in the background, candles flickered on the table, and the scent of baked goods filled the air. I wore my gray cardigan over a white blouse, paired with light blue jeans, an ensemble that balanced comfort and subtle elegance. My chestnut brown hair fell naturally over my shoulders, and I kept my makeup soft but polished. As guests arrived, I greeted each one warmly, offering drinks and smiles, but also making a point to engage with Eleanor indirectly. I didn't challenge her outright, but I positioned myself in ways that drew attention to my confidence and calm. I noticed small shifts in her demeanor, the slightest tightening of her lips, the way her eyes flicked to me with a hint of hesitation. I smiled to myself, knowing that my strategy was working. By mid-afternoon, the gathering had reached a natural rhythm. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and the warmth in my apartment was palpable. Eleanor entered late, unannounced, perhaps expecting to assert some form of dominance. Instead, she found herself in a room where her authority was irrelevant. I moved through the crowd, speaking with relatives she had historically favored, including a few aunts who had often ignored my presence. They greeted me warmly, engaged in conversation, and sought my opinion on holiday plans. Eleanor's discomfort was almost tangible. She approached me finally, her voice controlled but slightly strained. "Hannah," she said, clearly trying to assert normalcy. "I see you've organized quite the gathering." I offered a polite smile, my tone calm and measured. "Thank you, Eleanor. I wanted to create a space where everyone could feel welcome and enjoy the season." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but I could sense the subtle defeat in her posture. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that inclusion and respect were not dictated by her approval alone. My presence in the room was firm, quiet, and undeniable, a stark contrast to the humiliation she had attempted to impose days before. After she walked away, I felt a surge of internal validation. This was exactly what I had aimed for, not public confrontation, not anger-fueled revenge, but a quiet, strategic reclamation of respect. Each smile, each acknowledgement from other family members, reinforced the truth that I was not defined by Eleanor's whims. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in how the family interacted with me. Phone calls were less tense, invitations became more inclusive, and even Eleanor's commentary was tempered, cautious. It was a slow shift, almost imperceptible, but it reflected a new dynamic, one in which I had established boundaries and asserted my presence without compromising my dignity. Jason observed these changes with quiet pride. One evening, as we sipped tea together, he remarked, "It's incredible to watch. You've shifted the balance without ever raising your voice. She can't dismiss you anymore." I smiled softly, acknowledging his words. "It wasn't easy," I admitted. "But it's not about winning or losing. It's about asserting who I am and ensuring that respect isn't conditional." As the week progressed, I also began to reflect more deeply on my own growth. The humiliation, while painful, had been a catalyst. It forced me to confront long-standing patterns of compliance and self-doubt. I realized that in trying to be accepted, I had often silenced myself, diminished my own needs, and prioritized others' approval over my dignity. Eleanor's cruel words shattered the illusion that peace and inclusion were guaranteed through compliance. In that shattering, however, I found clarity and strength. I also began to notice a shift within myself that extended beyond family dynamics. My confidence in professional settings improved, my friendships deepened, and my sense of agency in daily decisions strengthened. The emotional resilience I had cultivated through this family confrontation became a foundation upon which I could build other areas of my life. One evening, as I walked through a quiet neighborhood park, I reflected on the recent events. The crisp air, the soft glow of streetlights, and the rustle of fallen leaves provided a serene backdrop for contemplation. I realized that Eleanor's attempt to marginalize me had inadvertently illuminated my own capacity for composure, strategy, and emotional intelligence. The power she believed she held depended entirely on my compliance, and I had refused to comply. The realization was liberating. I no longer feared her judgment or craved her approval. Instead, I approached interactions with calm confidence, understanding that my worth was intrinsic, not granted by others. Each deliberate choice, whether hosting gatherings, engaging family members, or maintaining composure in her presence, was an assertion of self-respect. In a subtle, quiet way, I also began to witness the impact of my actions on others. Jason's confidence in our partnership grew. Family members began including me in planning and decisions, and even Eleanor, while not fully conceding, began to navigate our interactions with greater caution. The narrative had shifted, not through confrontation, but through steadfast presence and deliberate action. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without challenges. There were moments of doubt, fleeting pangs of frustration, and occasional reminders of Eleanor's sharp words. But each challenge was met with a new resilience, a reminder that humiliation and exclusion are temporary, while dignity, composure, and strategic assertion create lasting influence. By the end of Part 3, I had begun to understand a profound truth. The dynamics that Eleanor tried to enforce through intimidation were not immutable. Respect and inclusion are earned, not demanded, and the subtle assertion of self-worth can shift even the most entrenched hierarchies. Christmas had been a crucible, but from it, I emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more aware of my own capacity for quiet, lasting influence. The first weeks of the new year carried a strange sense of calm and tension all at once. On one hand, Eleanor's blunt dismissal during Christmas dinner seemed to fade, her words now a distant echo rather than a sharp wound. On the other hand, I knew better than to assume that family dynamics would shift entirely on their own. Change required consistency, presence, and careful navigation. I had learned the power of subtle assertion, and now it was time to expand that influence beyond a single event. Each morning, I began with small rituals, writing in my journal, reviewing my schedule, planning interactions, and reflecting on past challenges. These quiet moments grounded me, reminding me that my growth wasn't about proving anything to Eleanor or anyone else. It was about recognizing my own strength and refusing to yield to humiliation. My home had become a sanctuary, a place where I could practice patience, strategy, and composure in preparation for moments when family dynamics would test me again. Jason, ever supportive, continued to be my anchor. We spent evenings discussing subtle strategies, examining past interactions, and forecasting possible conflicts. One night, over coffee and soft music, he remarked, "You're changing the family climate without them even realizing it. It's incredible to watch." I smiled, appreciating his encouragement, but I knew that observation alone wasn't enough. The real test would come when family gatherings occurred again, when Eleanor attempted to assert control, and when others might unconsciously side with her expectations. I needed to ensure that my presence was both undeniable and respected, without relying on anger or direct confrontation. A week later, I received an invitation to a casual post-holiday brunch at Eleanor's house. My chest tightened at first. The memory of being kicked out of Christmas dinner still stung. But I reminded myself of the lessons I had learned: composure, calm assertion, and deliberate presence. This was an opportunity to observe, engage, and subtly reclaim influence in a setting where I had previously been marginalized. I dressed carefully, choosing a soft gray sweater and black trousers, comfortable yet sophisticated. My hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and my makeup was minimal but polished. Every detail mattered, not for show, but as a reflection of the calm confidence I intended to project. As Jason and I approached the house, I felt the familiar pang of tension, but it was tempered by a growing sense of agency. I had survived worse, and I was no longer willing to allow intimidation to dictate my behavior. Inside, Eleanor greeted us with her usual polite stiffness. She offered a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hannah," she said, voice measured. "Glad you could make it." I returned the smile evenly. "Thank you for inviting us. It's lovely to see everyone again." The brunch unfolded predictably at first: casual conversations, clinking dishes, and the soft hum of background music. But I noticed subtle shifts in how family members interacted with me. Aunts and cousins who had previously overlooked my presence now engaged with genuine curiosity, asking about my work, my hobbies, and my plans for the year. Their responses were warm, inclusive, and attentive, signaling a quiet shift in perception. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed to hover on the edge, attempting to maintain control through subtle remarks and questions aimed at establishing hierarchy. But each attempt was met with calm, polite responses from me, coupled with strategic engagement of other family members. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I allowed my presence, composure, and interactions to speak for themselves. At one point, Eleanor leaned toward a cousin and whispered something about my supposed shortcomings. I caught the faintest glint of miscalculation in her eyes. She expected me to flinch, to react with anger or embarrassment. Instead, I simply smiled, excused myself briefly to help serve refreshments, and returned moments later, calm and unshaken. The subtle power dynamics had shifted, and I could see it reflected in the cautious glances Eleanor exchanged with others. By mid-afternoon, I realized that the gathering had become a subtle demonstration of my growing influence. Family members were drawn to my calm, confident presence. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter was genuine, and Eleanor's attempts at dominance seemed increasingly irrelevant. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from triumph over her, but from the recognition that I had carved out a space where respect was automatic because I embodied it. After brunch, Jason and I took a quiet walk outside. The winter air was crisp, the sky a pale gray, and the faint smell of pine lingered from nearby trees. "You handled that perfectly," Jason said softly. She didn't even realize she was losing ground. I nodded, reflecting on the progress we had made. "It's not about winning, Jason. It's about showing that respect is earned and maintained, not dictated by fear or tradition." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "And you're proving that every day." In the following weeks, I continued to assert my presence through subtle, deliberate actions. I hosted small gatherings, coordinated holiday and birthday plans, and ensured that my opinions and preferences were acknowledged. Each interaction reinforced the idea that my dignity and inclusion were non-negotiable. I no longer relied on overt confrontation. Instead, I cultivated influence through calm confidence, consistency, and subtle assertion. Eleanor's behavior began to shift, though not dramatically. She still maintained her formal demeanor, still attempted to assert authority in minor ways, but the underlying tension had changed. She could no longer rely on fear or humiliation to control interactions. I had established boundaries, and family members increasingly recognized my presence as legitimate and respected. One afternoon, as I prepared dinner at home, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone. The humiliation of Christmas dinner had been painful, yes, but it had also been a catalyst for growth. I had learned to navigate complex family dynamics, to assert myself without aggression, and to cultivate respect through presence and composure. Each small victory, each subtle shift in perception, reinforced my confidence and strengthened my sense of agency. Jason watched me thoughtfully, sensing the depth of my reflection. "You've changed the family climate," he said quietly. "And not through confrontation, but through quiet strength." I smiled, acknowledging his words. "It's not about defeating anyone. It's about being unshakable, about showing that I belong and that my dignity is non-negotiable." As the weeks passed, I also began to notice changes within myself that extended beyond family dynamics. My confidence in professional settings improved, my friendships deepened, and my sense of agency in daily decisions strengthened. The emotional resilience I had cultivated through this confrontation became a foundation upon which I could build other areas of my life. By the time February arrived, the sting of Christmas dinner had faded, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in my growth and influence. I realized that the power Eleanor believed she wielded depended entirely on my compliance, and I had refused to comply. Each deliberate choice, whether hosting gatherings, engaging family members, or maintaining composure in her presence, was an assertion of self-respect. In a quiet moment one evening, I sat by the window, watching the first hints of spring in the garden below. The soft light reflected off the frost still clinging to the branches, a reminder that change is gradual and often subtle. Eleanor's attempts to diminish me had illuminated my own capacity for patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence. I understood now that humiliation and exclusion are temporary, while dignity, composure, and subtle assertion create lasting influence. By the end of Part 4, I had established a new reality. Christmas dinner had been a crucible, a painful but transformative experience. From it, I emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of my own power to navigate complex family dynamics. Respect and inclusion were no longer conditional upon Eleanor's approval. They were built upon my presence, composure, and consistent assertion of self-worth. And in that understanding, I found a quiet, enduring sense of victory. Not over Eleanor, not through anger or confrontation, but through the subtle, undeniable assertion of who I was, a woman capable of standing firm, cultivating influence, and commanding respect without ever raising her voice. By early March, the quiet aftermath of Christmas had given way to a sense of anticipation. Each family interaction was a test, not of my endurance, but of my composure and strategy. I no longer approached these encounters with fear or resentment. Instead, I observed, assessed, and subtly influenced. My approach had become deliberate, a balance of patience, presence, and quiet assertion. Jason and I had established new routines. Our mornings were calm, our evenings deliberate, and our weekends often filled with small gatherings designed to reinforce inclusivity. These weren't grand, ostentatious events. They were simple, warm, and intentional. The purpose wasn't to flaunt my influence, but to demonstrate through action that respect and inclusion could be cultivated independently of Eleanor's approval. One Friday evening, I hosted a casual dinner at our apartment. I wore a cream-colored sweater paired with dark jeans, comfort and subtle elegance, signaling calm authority without seeking attention. My hair was loosely tied back, and my makeup was natural but polished, reflecting the confidence I had cultivated over weeks of careful observation and reflection. As guests arrived, I greeted them with warmth, offering drinks and engaging in genuine conversation. Extended family members, some of whom had previously ignored me or deferred to Eleanor, now approached with interest, asking about my career, hobbies, and opinions. I answered thoughtfully, weaving personal anecdotes with humor and insight. The room buzzed with laughter and engagement, a stark contrast to the tension-filled Christmas dinner weeks before. Eleanor arrived later, unannounced as usual, expecting to assert dominance. But the atmosphere in the room was different now. I moved confidently among our guests, engaging with them naturally, subtly drawing attention without confrontation. Her attempts to interject or control the flow of conversation were met with calm, polite responses from me, redirecting the energy without conflict. At one point, she leaned toward Jason, whispering something I couldn't hear. I noticed the subtle hesitation in his response and the slight tightening of Eleanor's lips, a silent acknowledgement that her authority had been disrupted. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not born of malice, but of the realization that composure and strategic presence could shift dynamics more effectively than confrontation or anger. Later that evening, as dishes were cleared and laughter lingered in the air, Eleanor approached me directly. Her expression was measured, lips pressed together, eyes searching for a reaction. "Hannah," she said softly, "I see you've handled yourself well tonight." I smiled politely, my tone calm and measured. "Thank you, Eleanor. I've learned that creating a welcoming environment and engaging sincerely with family brings more fulfillment than seeking approval or confrontation." She nodded slowly, a subtle shift in her posture hinting at recognition, perhaps even grudging respect. I knew better than to expect full admission or apology, but the acknowledgement itself was a victory. It was proof that my strategy, quiet, deliberate, and composed, was effective. The following week, I continued to assert my presence in subtle, meaningful ways. I coordinated family events, initiated conversations, and ensured that my preferences and opinions were acknowledged. Each interaction reinforced my sense of agency, further eroding Eleanor's previously uncontested authority. Jason observed these changes closely. One evening, as we reviewed upcoming family plans, he remarked, "It's amazing to watch. You're changing how the family interacts without ever raising your voice. She can't ignore you anymore." I nodded, understanding the depth of his observation. "It's not about winning, Jason. It's about establishing boundaries and showing that respect isn't conditional." The weeks passed, and I noticed more subtle shifts. Family members began inviting me into decisions, seeking my input, and acknowledging my presence in ways that had once been unimaginable. Eleanor's attempts at dominance became less frequent and less effective. Her confidence, once unshakable, now had visible cracks, subtle though they were. One Saturday afternoon, I received a call from my cousin, inviting me to a small family gathering at her home. "We'd love for you to come," she said warmly. "It wouldn't be the same without you." I smiled, feeling the quiet validation of my efforts. "Thank you, I'll be there," I replied. That evening, Jason and I arrived at the gathering, greeted by familiar faces and warm conversation. The atmosphere was inclusive and relaxed, a testament to the subtle influence I had cultivated over the past months. Eleanor arrived later, her presence subdued, her attempts at dominance increasingly unnecessary. I moved through the gathering with calm confidence, engaging with family members naturally and ensuring that my presence was felt without demanding it. Each interaction reinforced my dignity and influence, subtly reminding Eleanor and others that respect was earned through presence, composure, and engagement, not granted through fear or tradition. Later, as we walked home, Jason remarked, "You've done something incredible. The family dynamic has shifted entirely, and you did it with grace." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It's not about defeating anyone. It's about being unshakable, about showing that dignity and respect are non-negotiable. In the following weeks, I also began to reflect on my personal growth. The events surrounding Christmas and the subsequent months had forced me to confront long-standing patterns of compliance, self-doubt, and deference. I realized that in trying to maintain peace, I had often diminished my own voice, prioritized others' approval, and allowed fear to dictate my actions. The humiliation at Christmas had shattered the illusion that compliance ensured inclusion. In that moment of clarity, I found strength, purpose, and resilience. I also noticed changes in Jason. His support became more pronounced, his confidence in our partnership strengthened, and his interactions with family shifted subtly to reflect mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. Together, we navigated complex dynamics with awareness and patience, reinforcing each other's sense of agency and empowerment. By the end of Part 5, I had established a new reality. The sting of Christmas humiliation had transformed into a catalyst for growth, confidence, and subtle influence. Eleanor's attempts at control had lost their potency, and my presence was increasingly acknowledged, respected, and included. I had learned a vital truth. Respect and inclusion are not granted by fear, tradition, or dominance. They are cultivated through presence, composure, and consistent assertion of dignity. Humiliation may wound, but it can also illuminate strength, resilience, and the capacity to navigate complex dynamics with grace. As I sat quietly one evening, reflecting on the months since that fateful dinner, I realized that my transformation was complete in ways Eleanor could neither acknowledge nor control. I had turned a moment of pain into a lasting assertion of self-worth, influence, and empowerment. And in that realization, I felt a profound sense of quiet victory, one that required no applause, no confrontation, and no malice, only the unwavering presence of a woman who refused to be diminished. Spring had begun to hint at its arrival when I realized that the subtle shifts in family dynamics were becoming more permanent. The frost of the past months had melted into something warmer, a cautious, yet undeniable acknowledgement of my presence. Eleanor, while still carefully measured in her interactions, could no longer ignore the fact that her authority had limits. Every dinner, casual gathering, and phone call reminded her and everyone else that I was not someone to be dismissed lightly. I began to notice how these changes affected my daily life beyond family interactions. The patience, composure, and strategic thinking I had cultivated in response to Eleanor's harsh dismissal were now tools I could apply elsewhere. At work, I found myself navigating challenging projects with greater confidence, asserting opinions without hesitation, and managing colleagues with a quiet but firm authority. Socially, my friendships deepened. I spoke more openly, listened more attentively, and engaged more meaningfully. It became clear that the growth catalyzed by family conflict was not contained. It was expanding into every corner of my life. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to host a small spring brunch at our apartment, extending invitations to family members who had been particularly inclusive during the past months. My goal was not to challenge Eleanor, but to establish a routine of presence, subtly reinforcing that inclusion was now a shared reality rather than a privilege, she dictated. I dressed in a soft pastel sweater and white slacks, my chestnut hair cascading naturally over my shoulders. The ensemble reflected calm confidence and understated elegance, a visual extension of the inner strength I had cultivated. As guests arrived, I greeted each one warmly, offering drinks and sharing small, personal anecdotes. The room filled with laughter and genuine conversation, a living testament to the subtle influence I had cultivated. Eleanor arrived later, as expected, but her demeanor was subdued, her attempts to assert control increasingly redundant. She scanned the room, likely seeking some sign of discord or humiliation, but found none. Instead, she encountered smiles, engagement, and acknowledgement of my presence, a reality she could no longer manipulate. I moved through the gathering with calm confidence, checking in with guests, guiding conversations, and ensuring everyone felt included. My presence was firm, gentle, and deliberate. Each interaction reinforced the reality that I had established. Respect and inclusion were not dependent on fear, dominance, or past hierarchies. My dignity and influence were now intrinsic, not conditional. At one point, Eleanor approached me, her expression carefully neutral. "Hannah," she said softly, "I see that you've really made this space welcoming." I returned her measured smile, keeping my tone calm. "Thank you, Eleanor. I've learned that creating warmth and genuine engagement fosters inclusion far better than asserting control or exclusion ever could." She paused, the faintest trace of acknowledgement flickering in her eyes. It was subtle, yet significant. She was recognizing, without admitting it aloud, that her previous tactics were no longer effective. I allowed the moment to pass without pressing, understanding that true influence was more powerful than confrontation. It was consistent, calm, and undeniable. Jason watched the interaction closely, a small, appreciative smile tugging at his lips. Later, as we tidied the apartment, he said softly, "You've completely shifted the family dynamic. It's remarkable how quiet and deliberate your approach has been." I nodded, reflecting on the months of effort. "It's not about defeating anyone, Jason. It's about establishing my presence, my dignity, and showing that respect cannot be taken away by anyone, no matter how loud or controlling they are. In the weeks that followed, I continued to strengthen my influence through subtle, deliberate actions. I coordinated family events, engaged relatives in meaningful conversation, and maintained a calm, composed demeanor even when Eleanor tried to interject or assert dominance. Each interaction was a reinforcement of boundaries, a quiet reminder that respect was no longer conditional. I also began to notice shifts in others' behavior. Extended family members sought my input on planning and decisions, referenced my opinions in conversations, and included me in discussions that previously excluded me. Eleanor's attempts to assert authority had less impact, her influence subtly diminished by the undeniable reality of my presence. One Saturday morning, Jason and I decided to host a brunch specifically for extended family members who had shown support and inclusion in recent months. The event was light, casual, and intentionally warm. I wore a soft green blouse with cream pants, my hair pulled back into a relaxed style, reflecting calm confidence. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with laughter, conversation, and genuine warmth. Eleanor arrived late, as expected, and I noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the quiet realization that she no longer controlled the room. Throughout the brunch, I navigated interactions with calm composure. I checked in with guests, engaged in meaningful conversations, and subtly guided discussions in ways that emphasized collaboration and inclusion. Each interaction reinforced the subtle, undeniable shift in family dynamics. Eleanor's attempts to dominate or interject were increasingly ineffective, met with polite redirection or engagement of others in conversation. After the brunch, as we walked home, Jason reflected on the day. "You've done something extraordinary," he said. "You've shifted the family climate without confrontation, without anger. They can't ignore you anymore." I smiled softly, feeling the quiet satisfaction of months of deliberate action. "It's not about defeating anyone," I said. "It's about standing firm in my dignity, creating space for inclusion, and demonstrating that respect is non-negotiable." The transformation extended beyond family interactions. I noticed subtle changes in my own behavior and perception. I approached professional challenges with greater confidence, handled personal conflicts with calm assertiveness, and engaged in social situations with a sense of assured presence. The lessons learned from Eleanor's attempts at exclusion had become internalized, shaping my approach to life more broadly. By the end of Part 6, the family dynamic had shifted in profound, though subtle, ways. My presence was no longer contingent upon Eleanor's approval. Respect and inclusion were now established through consistent demonstration of composure, confidence, and thoughtful engagement. Eleanor's influence had waned, her authority diminished by the quiet power of deliberate, patient assertion. I had learned that humiliation and exclusion, while painful, could catalyze growth, resilience, and lasting influence. The experience had revealed strengths I hadn't fully recognized and strategies for navigating complex dynamics with grace. I understood now that true power lies not in confrontation or dominance, but in consistency, composure, and the unwavering assertion of dignity. In quiet moments alone, I reflected on the journey, the sting of Christmas, the subtle reclamation of presence, and the gradual, undeniable shift in respect and influence. I realized that the transformation was as much internal as external. I had cultivated patience, composure, strategic thinking, and confidence, qualities that extended far beyond family interactions and would serve me in every facet of life. And in that reflection, I found a profound sense of quiet triumph. Not through anger or revenge, but through consistent, deliberate presence and assertion of self-worth. The family dynamic had changed, and more importantly, I had changed. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient, capable of navigating any challenge with grace, strategy, and quiet authority. By early April, the atmosphere within the family had transformed almost imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. The sharp edge of exclusion that had once accompanied every interaction with Eleanor had dulled, replaced by an uneasy, almost grudging acknowledgement of my presence. I no longer felt tension coursing through my chest when I approached family gatherings. Instead, I felt a quiet assurance that I had earned a place, on my terms, with dignity intact. Jason noticed the change immediately. "You walk in and the room shifts," he said one evening as we prepared dinner together. "You don't even try to assert yourself, and yet everyone respects you." I smiled, feeling the weight of months of deliberate action and reflection. "It's not about them anymore," I said softly. "It's about me. About being unshakable and not letting anyone dictate my worth or inclusion." The turning point became clear during the spring family barbecue, a casual gathering hosted by my cousin in the backyard of her house. The sun was warm, the smell of grilled food mingling with fresh grass, and laughter carried across the yard. I had chosen a soft blue blouse and dark jeans, simple but elegant, signaling calm confidence. My chestnut hair was loose, catching the sunlight as I moved through the gathering, greeting each family member warmly. Eleanor arrived, as she often did, late, with a forced smile and that familiar stiffness in her posture. But the room had changed, and so had I. My interactions with family members were confident, inclusive, and natural, a subtle assertion of presence that no longer required confrontation or defensiveness. As she scanned the gathering, I could see her recalibrating, realizing that her attempts to dominate were increasingly redundant. During the barbecue, several cousins approached me, thanking me for organizing a recent family dinner and asking for my input on upcoming plans. Their genuine engagement was a clear signal that my influence had taken root. I responded graciously, offering ideas and listening attentively, reinforcing the inclusive and collaborative atmosphere I had cultivated. Eleanor, watching from a distance, attempted a few quiet interjections, comments meant to steer conversations or assert authority, but each time I subtly redirected dialogue to involve others, maintaining calm composure. Her influence was no longer automatic, it required effort, and increasingly, it went unnoticed. At one point, she approached me directly, her voice quiet and measured. "Hannah," she said, "I see how things have changed. You've handled yourself with dignity." I smiled politely, keeping my tone calm and unflustered. "Thank you, Eleanor. I've learned that consistent presence, patience, and respect create inclusion far better than control or exclusion ever could." Her eyes flickered with a mix of acknowledgement and reluctance. She didn't apologize, didn't admit wrongdoing, but the recognition was subtle and undeniable. The power dynamics had shifted, not through confrontation, but through consistent, deliberate action. Jason stood nearby, quietly observing. Later, he whispered, "You've done it. You've changed the entire dynamic, and you didn't need to raise your voice once." I nodded, reflecting on the months of effort. It hadn't been easy. The humiliation of Christmas dinner had left a lingering sting, but that sting had catalyzed growth. I had learned patience, strategic engagement, composure, and the ability to assert influence subtly but effectively. These lessons had expanded beyond family interactions, affecting work, friendships, and every aspect of life where confidence and presence mattered. As the afternoon unfolded, I noticed subtle changes in other family members' behavior. They sought my advice, included me in conversations naturally, and treated my opinions with consideration and respect. Eleanor's attempts to assert dominance were increasingly unnecessary, met with polite acknowledgement rather than fear or compliance. In quiet moments that evening, after the gathering ended and everyone had left, Jason and I sat on the back porch, sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You've changed things," he said softly. "Not just for yourself, but for the entire family. And you didn't need to fight, argue, or be angry to do it." I took a deep breath, letting the warm evening air fill my lungs. "It's about showing that dignity and respect are inherent, not conditional," I said. Once I stopped allowing fear or exclusion to dictate my actions, everything shifted naturally. The events of the past months had transformed me in profound ways. I realized that the humiliation of being kicked out of Christmas dinner was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a journey towards self-respect, influence, and subtle, undeniable power. Every interaction, Every gathering and every small assertion of presence had reinforced the truth. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be cultivated, and the most effective way to do so is through calm, consistent, and deliberate engagement. I also noticed how these changes affected Jason. His confidence in our partnership had strengthened, his interactions with family members became more equitable, and his own sense of agency was subtly enhanced by our shared experience. Together, we navigated complex dynamics with patience, strategy, and calm authority, reinforcing each other's growth and influence. Weeks later, as spring began to bloom fully, I received an invitation from my parents for a late spring family dinner. The invitation was casual, but the timing and tone suggested an acknowledgement of my presence and influence. I chose a soft lavender blouse with tailored trousers, a look that reflected understated confidence and calm authority. My hair was styled simply, letting the natural chestnut waves fall freely. At the dinner, the atmosphere was noticeably different from that fateful Christmas evening. Family members engaged freely, conversations flowed easily, and laughter was genuine. Eleanor was present, of course, but her attempts at control were increasingly muted, met with polite acknowledgement rather than deference or compliance. My presence was natural, respected, and included, an undeniable assertion of influence cultivated over months of deliberate action. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor approached me once more. Her expression was measured, her voice calm. "Hannah," she said softly, I see now. You've truly earned your place here." I smiled, feeling a quiet sense of completion. "Thank you, Eleanor. I've learned that creating warmth, presence, and inclusion is far more effective than asserting control or exclusion." She nodded, her eyes betraying a subtle recognition of the truth she could not openly admit. It was not a dramatic victory, nor did it require confrontation. It was a quiet, enduring acknowledgement of the change I had cultivated through patience, strategy, and unwavering composure. As Jason and I walked home later, the evening air cool but refreshing, he whispered, "You've done something incredible. The family sees your strength now, and it's undeniable." I nodded, feeling the profound satisfaction that came from months of deliberate growth. "It wasn't about defeating anyone," I said. "It was about standing firm, cultivating respect, and showing that dignity is non-negotiable." In the weeks that followed, family interactions continued to reflect this subtle but undeniable shift. Eleanor's attempts at dominance were increasingly irrelevant, and my presence was treated with genuine respect. Extended family members engaged with me naturally, seeking my input and acknowledging my role within the family. The transformation was permanent, quiet, and profound, a testament to the power of composure, patience, and deliberate assertion of self-worth. Reflecting on the journey from that painful Christmas evening to this spring, I understood that the real victory was internal. I had transformed humiliation into strength, exclusion into influence, and resentment into composure. I had cultivated a sense of agency and confidence that no one could take away. The experience taught me a vital lesson: respect, inclusion, and influence are not granted by fear, tradition, or dominance. They are earned through consistent, calm, deliberate action. Humiliation may wound temporarily, but it can illuminate strength, resilience, and the capacity to navigate complex dynamics with grace. By the end of Part 7, I had established a new family reality. I was respected, included, and acknowledged not through confrontation or malice, but through presence, composure, and subtle assertion of influence. Eleanor could no longer diminish me. My dignity was inherent, and my influence was undeniable. And in that quiet, unassuming victory, I felt a sense of lasting fulfillment. I had turned a moment of pain into an enduring testament to strength, patience, and empowerment, a reminder that true power lies not in confrontation or anger, but in consistent, calm, and deliberate assertion of self-worth. The Christmas humiliation was now a distant memory, replaced by the quiet triumph of a woman who refused to be diminished, who cultivated respect through presence, and who reclaimed her place with unwavering composure. I had made Eleanor, and everyone else, realize that true influence comes not from exclusion or control, but from strength, dignity, and the ability to stand unshaken in one's own worth. And that, I knew, was a victory that no words of exclusion could ever erase.